Look, Kowser, well, we all know that you possess some artistic ability. You know, we've seen the cartoons over the years. But that shit is just flat fucking wasted on that slag fucking bitch WB. Real fucking talk. I mean, all day today it's been like fucking WB day. You know, you post the fucking cartoon, and then of course, ever since he got outed by Damp Wolf, fucking SWV is just piling it on. And today it's all about how he closed the deal with with WB, which we all know is complete and utter horse shit. You know, on the off chance, on the 0.000000001% chance that SWV is in fact not a fucking fruit, there is a 100% chance that he has never closed the deal with any female, anywhere, at any time. Unless it was a fucking, a transaction. So the moral of the story, folks, is motherfuck SWV, motherfuck WB, stay dead, you slag fucking cunt bitch. Yeah, that's about it. Nueve.
Rather than the momentary, logical pros and cons that weigh into the situation you might be facing here. Now, fast forward a few centuries, and as we all know, the Christians go from a persecuted sect in Rome to running the joint when it comes to Western Europe. And when the Western Roman Empire goes away and leaves all these successor states in its wake, the vast majority are Christian, and the ones that aren't will be. This is I think it's fair to say, if you go from like late antiquity to, when the age of reason begins, this is Europe at its most intense religiosity, right? Their most fervent. This is the era where, it encompasses the Crusades, it encompasses all the religious wars that happened because of the schism between, the Protestants and the Catholics. I mean, there's a lot that go into this, and a ton of people will die. I mean, witches, inquisitions, it's all during this era. There's a line, and I'm going from memory, that I once read a historian said, that they said in this era, the most vicious procedures were inflicted on devout Christians by even more devout Christians. You have near universal Catholicism in these countries until the Great Schism with Martin Luther. There are enclaves of Jews. There's actually Islamic folks in some places, and there's a bunch of heretical Christian sects. Whether they're Christian or not, of course, is the main issue, that are being wiped out and persecuted. But there's a worldview now in place, right? A reality that in some ways is like our own. If you drop an apple, gravity does what gravity does, right? It does now, and it did then. But there are other elements of reality that are believed to be 100% valid by almost everybody, that influences everything. Take, for example, the near unanimity of the idea that there is a heaven and a hell and a God watching over everything, and that everything is divinely ordained. Now, we have people, of course, who believe that today, but it's one of many different belief systems out there. In fact, one of the great things about living in a free society, in a free part of the world, is that you're free to pick and choose your own reality, within limits. I mean, you still have to acknowledge gravity, but otherwise, you can treat it like a, buffet, if you will, and I'm going to take a little bit of Eastern mysticism, mix it with Catholic doctrine, add a little bit of, hard science and some UFOlogy, because I like that, plus massage, and, whip it into a 21st century, philosophical smoothie if you want. But I think we have to recognize that that's a freedom that did not exist in most times and most places. There are, of course, eras and places where it did, but by and large, the belief system was a lot more constrained, both legally and obviously in terms of religion and faith, but also because of the old garbage in, garbage out element of what were the people even being exposed to. I mean, take, for example, an illiterate person in the middle of Europe in, I don't know, we'll say, the 10th century. What do you know? You know probably the religious texts that were read to you by somebody else and anything you personally experienced. Well, that's going to limit your worldview right there. And if there's 100% belief in the religious texts and everyone else feels the same way, well, that helps explain the accounts of some of the executions that have come down to us from this era, which are as bizarre as anything I've ever seen. But without the faith explanation, it doesn't make any sense. So first of all, when we talk about executions in the Middle Ages, what do we mean? Historian Paul Friedland points out, by the way, that there are far fewer sources and accounts of executions from this era than you would think, considering its infamy in terms of torture and execution. Quite a bit of torture, though. A lot of mutilations during this time period, right? Very eye for an eye. You could lose a hand if you're a thief. A lot of that kind of stuff. In his book, The Lure of the Arena, historian Garrett G. Fagan writes, quote, "Passing beyond antiquity, our sources for the Dark Age punitive practices are not good. But throughout the Middle Ages in continental Europe, it is clear that many forms of aggravated execution and public torture were employed, including burning, boiling alive in oil, feet first, decapitation, burial alive, drawing and quartering, branding, flogging, and miscellaneous forms of mutilation. For those guilty of multiple offenses, cumulative punishment could be applied, if stipulated by the court. In this way, lethal and non-lethal punishments were often combined, so that torture preceded execution or mutilation of the body was carried out post-mortem. The Sachsenspiegel," he continues, "an illuminated German legal code of 1220 to 1235 AD, shows beheading, hanging, hacking, the birching and shearing of women tied to a stake, and mutilation. It is not evident from the Sachsenspiegel, however, that these punishments attracted crowds, but there is no reason to think that they did not." End quote. If these executions in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance did indeed draw crowds, and I don't see why they wouldn't, what were the crowds there for? What was the draw? What did they expect to have happen? What did they hope to have happen? Well, this is why we sort of set up the religious stuff up till now, because that's what twists this in a unique way. Because if I told you that the legal system wanted an exemplary deterrent to, deter people from committing crimes, and that's why they hung up bodies and pieces of bodies and heads on stakes at the bridges and all that, that wouldn't surprise you, would it? I mean, justice has always had a deterrent effect, or there's always been a lot of theories about that. There's nothing new in that question. It's the religious side that to the modern mind is harder to understand. What if you went to this execution, instead of feeling, I think we have a mindset, a stereotype in our minds of how these executions go with the crowd, and the crowd is jeering and throwing refuse and heaping abuse on the condemned as they make their way to the scaffold or the gallows or the Ravenstone. And then when they're up there just about to die, the crowd is jeering at them and all this. And while this did happen, and the sources say it depends on what the bad person did and how they comported themselves during the whole process, but more often than not in this period we're talking about right now, the crowd felt a connection to the condemned, a compassion. And if the whole thing went off well, the historians often describe this as being a spiritually moving event. One of them used the word, maybe two of them used the word, potentially beautiful. Now let's remind ourselves for a second about what this beautiful event might be, and then ask ourselves again what it would take for you or for me to watch this live and describe it afterwards as beautiful. So in his book, Rituals of Retribution, historian Richard Evans recounts the tale of an Englishman named John Taylor. who lived in the early 1600s and did a little traveling and wrote about what he saw. One of the things he saw is while he was visiting the continent, he got to see one of those executions that they weren't doing much where he was from anymore in England. As I said earlier, I think the English have a penchant for hanging that we'll talk about in a little bit, but it didn't mean they didn't do other things. It just meant it was a little bit more unusual. So when John Taylor goes to, the continent and sees an opportunity to go to an execution where they're breaking someone with the wheel, he goes. And he describes it in his language from that time period this way, quote, Monday, the 19th of August, about the hour of 12 at noon, the people of the town in great multitudes flocked to the place of execution, which is half a mile English, meaning distance, without the gates built more like a sconce than a gallows, for it is walled and ditched about with a drawbridge, and the prisoner came on foot, with a divine with him, meaning a priest or a religious figure, all the way exhorting him to repentance, and because death should not terrify him, they had given him many rouses and carouses of wine and beer, for it is the custom there to make such poor wretches drunk, whereby they may be senseless either of God's mercy or their own misery, but being prayed for by others, they themselves may die resolutely, or, to be feared, desperately. End quote. So then Taylor describes the execution, which would have been maybe unusual for him to see. He says, quote, the prisoner mounted on a mound of earth, built high on purpose that the people without may see the execution a quarter of a mile roundabout,